Good morning. It's good to see all of you here today, and it is an honor, truly, to be with you. The last couple of days, we have been moving from broad to specific. On Friday, we tried to cover the entire intertestamental period. You'll be the judge of whether that was successful, I guess. And then last night, we kind of zeroed in on one specific time period, dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this morning, we're going to focus in even more specifically on the career of one person, the Apostle Paul. And one of the things that makes the Apostle Paul so remarkable is the education he received. When one considers the career of the Apostle Paul, you can see God working, even before Paul realizes God is working. In fact, he says in Galatians chapter 1 that he was set apart from his mother's womb. So Paul has this real feeling that even before he knew God had a plan for him, God had a plan for him. And in his life in Tarsus, whenever he was living in a culture of the Gentiles, he got used to what life would be like on his missionary journeys. And then he had the unique opportunity to go to Jerusalem and study there and live there and spend time there. So he sort of had both sides. He had one foot planted in the Jewish diaspora, which we talked about some Friday evening, and another foot planted in Palestinian Judaism. There weren't a lot of people who had those kinds of experiences, and on top of those basic experiences, the level of education Paul apparently received in both of those environments made him really remarkable for his time. And that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. The first thing that I want us to look at is Paul's life in Tarsus. We don't know how long that took, and I'll talk about that just a little bit. And then we're going to talk about Paul's life in Jerusalem and the education he received in more of the Jewish side of things. So, starting out, I want to talk a little bit about Tarsus. Tarsus of Cilicia is probably a city known to you because that's where Paul is from. But in the ancient world, it was actually a really popular, well-known, important city. In fact, we can trace its history back some 4,000 years through time. Every major empire in that part of the world wanted control of Tarsus. All these trade routes sort of met up in the city of Tarsus. So it's extremely important for commercial purposes all the way back as far as we can trace its history. I'm going to skip a lot of the information that I could share with you and talk about Paul's, I'm going to kind of speculate a bit, but Paul's potential family connection. We know that Paul was born a Roman citizen. Question is, how was he born a Roman citizen? Now, from a Jewish family, it would have been highly unusual for people to have Roman citizenship, so they had to have gotten it from somewhere. And there are a couple of possibilities. Of course, Roman citizenship would be granted to the families of men who served 25 years in the Roman military, but that seems to be probably not quite as likely. More likely, in the year 67 BC, the Roman general Pompey acquired control of the city of Tarsus on behalf of the Romans, and he named the city at that point the capital city of Cilicia. And it may be at that point that Roman citizenship was granted to all the inhabitants of Tarsus. Now, if that's the case, that means Paul's family for at least a couple, maybe 3 generations back, were already in Tarsus. Maybe that's the case. In the year 47 BC, Julius Caesar came to Tarsus, and he renamed the city Juliopolis after himself. Thank goodness that title didn't stick. They kept calling it Tarsus. And then a little bit later, Mark Antony, some of us were talking about Mark Antony last night. Mark Antony had one of the most famous romances of all time with an Egyptian queen by the name of Cleopatra. He first met Cleopatra in Tarsus. She was sailing down this river Cydnus on her pleasure barge with her perfumed slave boys fanning her and looking as beautiful as she could manufacture, trying to seduce Mark Antony. The very first time he laid eyes on her was actually in the city of Tarsus. So a lot of really important things that are connected to events that you probably know about that happened in the city of Tarsus. A couple of things happened whenever Paul was either very young or right before his birth. In the year 28 BC, the Roman Republic changed to the Roman Empire, and they had their first emperor, a man by the name of Augustus, as we would call him by later times, Octavian in that time. And one of the things he wanted to do is to alter the social and commercial situation of the city of Tarsus. So he sent his own personal tutor in order to basically institute these educational and social reforms. And there were a couple of things that happened as a result. One is that there was a minimum income restriction imposed upon the inhabitants of Tarsus. People had to have a net worth of 500 drachmae, if you want to put that in modern dollars, $20,000 to $25,000. Now, that's not annual salary, that's net worth. I don't know if you could reckon the net worth of most people in, say, St. Louis. But $20,000 to $25,000, even today, would be, for a lot of people, fairly unusual. And so that made sure that the citizenry of Tarsus was very, very wealthy. That's the way they wanted it. Now, one of two things we can learn from that. Either Paul's family met that minimum income restriction, and therefore they were quite wealthy, which seems to be suggested by a lot of the experiences Paul is able to have, or they did not meet those income restrictions, and at that point they moved to Jerusalem. We don't really know. But another thing that happens as a result of the educational reputation of Tarsus, Strabo tells us this, and this also fits with things that Paul tells us about his own life. And I'll take a moment to talk about some of the things here. The people of Tarsus, Strabo lived in the 1st century. He died in the early 1st century AD, so his life overlaps with the life of Paul. The people of Tarsus have devoted themselves so eagerly, not only to philosophy, but also to the whole round of education, that is general secular education, encyclical studies, that they have surpassed Athens, Alexandria, or any other place that can be named where there have been schools and lectures of philosophers. Now, Athens and Alexandria, simply said, are the two most famous educational centers in the ancient world. Athens for philosophy and Alexandria basically for anything else. And Strabo says Tarsus was second to none when it came to education. And notice what he goes on to describe. But it is so different from other cities that there the men who are fond of learning are all natives. See, most people move to Alexandria and Athens to study, but the people in Tarsus, they're natives who study there. He says, and foreigners are not inclined to sojourn there, neither do these natives stay there, but they complete their education abroad. And when they do, they rarely go back home. Does that sound familiar? What is the Apostle Paul doing? He's completing his education in Jerusalem. So that's a very interesting comment that makes us wonder whether Paul was not just a typical person from the city of Tarsus who was expected to go somewhere else to finish his education, or whether his family had to move and they chose to move to Jerusalem. I will say this, the cost of living in Jerusalem in the 1st century was probably relatively high anyway, so it makes more sense, I think, that Paul's family they were people of wealth, and they could afford to send him there. We also know Paul had family living in Jerusalem, even in later times, so he was not the only person from his family who lived there. But in any case, I'll move on to Paul in Jerusalem. At what age did Paul come to Jerusalem? Well, he tells us in 2 places in the book of Acts that he was very young when he went there. In the book of Acts, chapter 24 and verse 26 and verse 4, he says he was there from his youth. It's hard to know what exactly that refers to. Some people have tried to impose the Jewish custom of bar mitzvah. You know, like today, if a Jewish boy crosses over into manhood, like at the age of 13, he's what they call bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah literally means a son of the commandment. And it sort of marks that young boy's entrance into manhood. So some people have said, well, that's what Paul is saying. He came to Jerusalem maybe when he was 12 years old. The problem is there's not really any contemporary evidence that the Jews at the time of Paul practiced that custom that we observe today. So it's hard to know if that is the case. Maybe more specifically is found in Acts chapter 22 and verse 3, if you want to take a look over there. Acts 22 and verse 3, and this is going to serve as more or less the theme text, I guess, for our thoughts this morning during the Bible class hour. But in Acts 22 and verse 3, Paul is talking to these Jews, and he says, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. So we learn he was born in Tarsus. We would translate this maybe in our modern dialect. He was reared in Jerusalem. What does that mean? Well, this word occurs a couple of other times in the Bible, a few other times in actually the writings of Luke. In Luke chapter 4, in verse number 16, it's used to refer to Jesus after his parents returned from Egypt and settled in Nazareth. And it says that Jesus was raised, or he was reared. He grew up in, we might translate it, Nazareth. Well, how old was Jesus when his family came back? 3, 4 years old? Okay, it's pretty young. In Acts chapter 7, this is a term used again in reference to Moses in actually 2 back-to-back verses. In verse 20, it's used in reference to Moses being reared in his parents' home before he's placed in the basket and sent down the Nile. I know we sort of picture Moses as a newborn baby kind of kicking around. Is that exactly what the Bible says, though? If you read the text carefully, what does it say? They kept the baby at home until they couldn't keep him any longer. And so Moses could have been a couple, 3 years old, whatever. And so he's sent down the river, and then he is, again it says in verse 21 of Acts 7, he was reared by Pharaoh's daughter in the house of Pharaoh. And so you have another case there of this word being used, but still quite young. And so some people have derived from those other usages that Paul must have come to Jerusalem when he was 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, very, very young. It could be, though, that Paul's using this word more in a metaphorical sense. We would use, like I said, the word brought up. I grew up in Henderson, Tennessee. What if I told you that? Of course, you wouldn't know whether that's right or wrong, I guess, but I'll tell you. I moved to Henderson along with my family when I was 13 years old. If I say I grew up in Henderson, would anybody argue with me? 13 is still pretty young. Went to 8th grade, went to high school there. But if I told you, well, I really grew up in Western Kentucky, where I first lived, first 12 years of my life, you probably wouldn't worry about that either. So it could kind of go either way. It kind of depends on how long you regard, or what time period you regard that term referring to. But we don't really know, is basically the conclusion, at what age Paul came to Jerusalem. Even though he tells us in a couple of passages, neither of those passages really allow us to nail down the exact age. Whenever Paul tells Timothy, by the way, in 1 Timothy 4, do not let anyone despise your youthfulness. People who have studied the life of Timothy estimate that he may be as old as 40 years old at that time. So you would think a young man would be maybe in his 20s, maybe in his teen years. Paul may be using that term for somebody in his late 30s. So the way that people looked at age and youth is quite a lot different then than we would think of in many respects today. But anyway, that's, I guess, neither here nor there. The one thing that we can say with certainty, and probably the more important point, is the last one here. And that is that Paul was educated at the feet of Gamaliel. What does that mean, and why is that important? Well, glad you asked the question. At the feet of Gamaliel has become sort of a metaphor. You say, well, I studied at the feet of, and you fill in the blank of your teacher. This is an expression that's kind of strange, and some people have said that it means something more than just Paul was a student of Gamaliel. Who is Gamaliel? Gamaliel the first, as he's sometimes called. He's also called Gamaliel the elder. He's called Rabban Gamaliel because according to the rabbis, he was the very first head of the Jewish Sanhedrin. He was also a member of the Pharisaic party, the strictest sect of the Jews. He's also remembered in the rabbinic sources for being one of the nicest, kindest, most generous rabbis of his time. Basically, Paul studied with one of the most famous Jewish teachers in the history of Jewish teaching. Now, that's pretty remarkable. For him to be born at exactly that time period, to go to Jerusalem at exactly that time, to get exactly that kind of instruction from exactly that kind of person. I've mentioned this key word several times this weekend, the word providence. Can you see the providence of God working in Paul's life, even when Paul did not recognize it was there? Maybe you could tell a similar story about places you ended up, people you met, and how you were sort of brought along to your faith almost providentially. You can't explain it. You don't understand it, but it sort of happened. Paul's life, I think, unfolds in a very similar way. A couple of things that are said about the life of Rabban Gamaliel is in the Mishnah, when I've got more here than it's on the screen, so I'll try to stick to the screen. When Rabban Gamaliel the elder died, the glory of the law of Moses, Torah, ceased and separateness died. Well, that's quite a thing to say, isn't it? I mean, that's like saying, I teach at Fried-Hardeman University. It's like saying, well, when so-and-so retires, they might as well close the doors. That's a remarkable statement. And I'll remind you, the Mishnah is written around the year 200. This is 150 years after Gamaliel lived. He's still remembered that way. It's explained a little bit more in the Talmud, which is written about 200 years after the Mishnah. So several centuries after the death of Gamaliel. Our rabbis taught from the days of Moses up to Rabban Gamaliel, the Torah, the law of Moses, was learned only standing. But when Rabban Gamaliel died, feebleness descended into the world. Everybody all of a sudden didn't want to stand up anymore. And they learned the Torah only sitting. So we have learned, and then it quotes this, from the time that Rabban Gamaliel died, full honor ceased to be paid to the Torah. Some people have taken this statement, which again is hundreds of years later than the life of the Apostle Paul. But they've taken this statement to indicate that when Paul says that he was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, what he's trying to tell us is that he learned the Torah standing up. So our expression would be toe to toe, so to speak. That he learned standing in the days when people used to stand up. It's hard to know whether this is actually reliable or not because it's from such a much later period of time. And in fact, a lot of what is said about Gamaliel in the rabbinic literature is also said about other figures. So it's hard to know what you can trust and what you can't because there are a lot of contradictory statements made. But there's one thing that is said about Gamaliel that is confirmed actually by the New Testament. And that is, he was known for his generosity and philanthropy. There is a statement or a term that the rabbis, even today, Jews use this, tikkun olam. It means something like the preservation of the world or something like that. What it means is acts of kindness, acts of generosity make the world go round. And Gamaliel is associated as a legendary figure of tikkun olam. Generosity, kindness, love, compassion, these kinds of ingredients. Now in Acts chapter 5, you have Peter and John before the Jewish council. They don't know what's going to happen to them. They could be executed. They could be imprisoned. Any number of things could happen to them. We know things don't always turn out well for early Christians in the custody of these Jewish leaders in the book of Acts. And you remember they're discussing what to do. What punishment should we come up with? And Rabbi Gamaliel stands up and he says, listen, if this movement that these guys are preaching is really from God, neither you nor I nor anyone else can do anything about it. But if it's from man, it will basically dissipate of its own weight. And so everybody said, hey, sounds good, whatever, we'll leave these guys alone. Now we don't know what Gamaliel knew and believed about Jesus of Nazareth. We don't know if maybe some early Christians later in his life taught him and he became sympathetic toward that message. We don't know any reason why he would have said that other than he seems to be a nice guy. But Gamaliel becomes an instrument through which the gospel can go forward. Isn't that kind of an interesting thing to observe? So it's one of those things that makes us wonder, again, whether the providence of God is not active in bringing that specific individual, whether he ever obeyed the gospel or not, at that specific moment, in that specific spot, to make sure that God's servants, Peter and John, could keep preaching the way they had been. So that's what I wanted to say about Gamaliel. I've got a lot more to say, but I probably should move on because I want to leave time for questions at the end. What I want to do now is transition into another area of Jewish education, and that is the synagogue itself. We know that the synagogues were important sources for Jews, not only in the land of Palestine, but throughout the first century world. We talked about, when we did our top 10 list on Friday night, how the synagogue, the development of the synagogue, is one of the most important things that happens in the intertestamental period, because it created a network for Paul and the other early Christians. When they went into all the world to preach the gospel, they stopped at the synagogues first, because there were people there who were already reading the same Bible they were reading. And so it gave them sort of a commonality with those people. The word synagogue is itself a bit of an interesting thing. It means probably something like a gathering place. That doesn't really mean anything all that significant. It's also called a place of prayer, a proselche in Greek, a place of prayer. So we know if they're calling it a place of prayer, it must have been a place where they prayed. But when you read the ancient sources, including the New Testament, which, by the way, is our best source on synagogues, we don't have that much Jewish literature that tells us all about what's going on in the synagogues. The New Testament really is our earliest and best source. But you find out that what they're doing primarily is preaching and teaching. Praying, yes, but preaching and teaching. That's why synagogues exist, to read the Bible and to teach the Bible. Now, how many of you own zero books? Raise your hand if you do not own a book. Okay. Raise your hand if you own one book. You don't own more than one book? If you have 2 copies of the Bible, you own more than one book, right? All right, see, you understand the point. Most of us today, we own lots of books. You can go outside a lot of used bookstores and there's a bin for the discarding of books. Right? They throw them away today. In the ancient world, that's not the case. Books are extraordinarily expensive, and virtually no one has a personal copy of the Bible. Very few people, less than 1%, have a complete copy of one book of the Bible. It's expensive to copy. Paper is expensive. If I asked you, how many books would you own if you had to pay $5 per page? The answer is not very many. Okay? And so we understand sort of the way this sort of thing works. It's way different there than it is in our time. So a synagogue, and by the way, the early church is the same way, became a place where people could gather to actually hear a book they very much cared about, they tried to pattern their life after. That's the place they could go and actually learn what that book said. They couldn't throw it open in their lap with coffee in their hands in the morning. They didn't have that luxury. And so synagogues became extremely important for all Jews in all places to actually know what God's will was for them in their lives. They didn't go there to hear a sermon primarily. I made this point Friday, but I wanted to sort of expound upon it this morning. So in Acts chapter 13, you'll remember, whenever Paul and Barnabas are visiting the synagogue and the synagogue attendant says to them, anybody has a word of exhortation, go ahead and say it. And Paul says, yeah, I can say something. And he got up and he preached the gospel. The reason that was possible is because people were there to hear the Bible, the law and the prophets being read. They weren't necessarily there to hear a sermon. If somebody got up and all they did in the period that we usually devote to the sermon is read the Bible, how many of you would stay awake? Don't raise your hand. How many of you would stay awake? We don't like being read to. Another factor there is that most of the people in this time period couldn't read themselves. It has really very little to do with education or wealth or anything like that, but estimates on the high end are 20% of the total population could read. Estimates on the low end are like 5% of the population could read. So somewhere, let's say between 80 and 95% of the people are unable to read for themselves, even if they could get their hands on a copy of the Bible. It's a totally different world. And so gathering places like synagogues and like churches become all that more important for people to know what God wants them to do. This is an inscription. It's called the Theodotus inscription because it's from a guy named Theodotus. And it says, Theodotus, son of Witanus, priest and synagogue leader. Now, the reason I point out the Greek word there, it's the same word that's used in the New Testament in the passage that we just referenced. The son of a synagogue leader, the grandson of a synagogue leader. Maybe this was an inherited position. What was a synagogue leader supposed to do? Well, we don't really know for sure. Probably to take care of the copies of the Bible that the synagogue collectively owned. Has anybody ever been to a congregation where the church had a Bible? A while ago, they used to have these. In fact, you can visit some old churches in Europe and stuff, and they'll still have them sort of as ornaments, and they're chained to the pulpit. Has anybody ever seen that before? You know why they're chained to the pulpit? Or why in old libraries books are chained to the bookshelf? Because they're incredibly valuable, they're extremely expensive, and everybody wanted to steal them. And so again, different world. Paper's cheap. You can get copies of the Bible for free on your phone, right? Different world. But he says that this synagogue was built for the reading of the law and the teaching of the precepts, the laws. The reading of the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, and the teaching of its laws. That's why synagogues existed. Well, what else did they do? Did they have fellowship meals? I don't know. That's what's most important, right, in the life of a church? I just ate a big donut. I got the biggest one I could find up there. That's what we do, right? We eat. I don't know if they ate or not. Maybe they did. Did they sing? No evidence for that, actually. One of the things that, somebody will challenge me on this, so I'll go ahead and explain what I just said. One of the things that you'll observe if you read a lot of books by some modern students, scholars, on the nature of the synagogue is they'll say, well, singing was a part of the synagogue, and then they'll refer to another modern scholar. And if you go chase down that other modern scholar, singing was a part of the synagogue, and they refer to another one. And what you won't find is anybody referring to any actual ancient sources that say it. You see, that's a good sign. We need to be careful whenever we're talking about something in the ancient world. We need ancient evidence to support it. This ought to make sense to people within the churches of Christ. Isn't it the case that we speak where the Bible speaks and remain silent where the Bible is silent? If we're going to do something, if we're going to teach something, if we're going to believe something, we need ancient evidence from the Word of God to support it. As a historian, my procedure is not really all that different. I want ancient evidence to support everything I say about what ancient people did. So it's kind of the same procedure that I follow in my research that I would follow in my faith as well. But going on, I wanted to talk about Paul's career as a Pharisee. So we know he had a knowledge of the Bible from the synagogues. We know that he has an understanding of Judaism from Gamaliel. He also has a very close commitment to the Pharisees. One of the things that I think maybe is kind of hard for us to figure sometimes is what exactly a Pharisee was. So I'll try to explain that. And Josh, what time am I supposed to quit? Like 40? So I have 5 minutes. No problem. Okay. Well, I need to back up. The Hebrew word Pharisee, it's probably from a Hebrew word. It means something like separated or separatist or something like that. These are first mentioned by Josephus. I mentioned this Friday, so I'll go through it pretty fast here. They're first mentioned by Josephus as coming up in the late part of the 2nd century BCE. And the New Testament is actually the very first literary source we have to mention Pharisees by name. Now, we know they existed well before the time of the New Testament, but they don't show up in any written document that predates the New Testament, which is an interesting observation. What were they known for? Well, they were known for their commitment to this oral tradition. Josephus says, the Pharisees have imposed on the people many laws from the tradition of the fathers not written in the law of Moses. Now you can see this with Jesus. In Matthew 15, verses 2 and 3, why do your disciples, Jesus asked the Pharisees asked Jesus, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat. Now, it's a good idea to wash your hands before you eat. But the Bible doesn't say that. Your grandmama taught you cleanliness is next to godliness, but God didn't teach you that, right? And so we understand that this is a tradition that the Pharisees imposed. Yeah.
The Pharisees believed, I know a lot of them believed, that there were two laws given on Mount Sinai, the written law and the oral law.
Right.
That's what they teach.
Yeah, I talked about that Friday night a little bit, about how they believed that on Mount Sinai, God gave the written law, which is basically recorded in the law of Moses as we have it now, and then the oral law, which was passed down from one generation to the next. And that oral law was mutually enlightening to the written law. And of course, the brilliance of this kind of system is, who has control over the oral law? Well, the Pharisees. So if you really want to know what God wants, you got to go ask a Pharisee. Now, the other side of this is they were extremely popular among the common people. Of all the Jewish groups we know about, the Pharisees represent what was probably the most popular position on many things. They were also very conservative, very strict. In the Mishnah, it says this, whoever expounds Scripture not in conformity with that oral law we're talking about has no share in the world to come. And he says in another place, it is more culpable to teach against the ordinances of the scribes than against the Torah itself. What they're saying is the oral law is just as important, if not more important, than the written law. Now, if you go down that path, that opens you up to a lot of possibilities, doesn't it? And it explains why all this rabbinic literature actually exists and why they talk about this stuff so often. Another thing, the Pharisees believed that there was an afterlife. Josephus explains this in terms of the transmigration of the soul, which to us seems extremely strange, and a lot of even Josephus scholars have tried to figure out what exactly he was saying. Probably the New Testament is a better source on this, because it says, the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, no angel, no spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. In other words, the Sadducees said, this life is all there is. Once you're dead, you're like Rover and dead all over, right? That's the Sadducees. The Pharisees, though, believed that there could be spiritual forms of existence, that maybe our spirits could precede our bodies. I don't want to open up a can of worms, but it's a really controversial topic in the early church about how souls come to be. Does God create a new soul whenever a couple becomes pregnant? Does God just sort of, wave a wand and a new soul is created out of nowhere and stuck into a body? Or does God have sort of this storage compartment of souls and He sends one down whenever a child is conceived? Or could it be that once a person dies, his soul kind of floats around until a child's conceived and he jumps in a body? The Pharisees believed that, according to Josephus, that God had so many souls put in so many people, when those people died, those souls just jumped into another person. Now that's pretty weird from our point of view, isn't it? The Bible doesn't give us any definitive teaching on this subject, it doesn't seem, so I don't know that anybody's ever thought about that before. Probably not encouraging to think about, so we'll just leave it alone. But the Pharisees believed that there could be a spiritual form of life outside of the body. The Sadducees did not. And Josephus tells us this. They also believed that there would be a resurrection at the end of time. That's based on Daniel chapter 12, where at the end of time, all these people will rise from the grave and there will be a judgment, all that kind of business. The Pharisees believed with that. Well, guess what? So did the early Christians. So they agree in some respects even themselves with Pharisaic theology. Free will, they believed in. It's interesting, the Mishnah says all is foreseen by God, but freedom is given. Isn't that what we're used to hearing? That God has foreknowledge, but He does not determine. The Essenes, another Jewish group at the time of Jesus, we talked about them Friday, they believed in determinism. Like you have some Christians who teach Calvinism today, that everything is predetermined. Those ranges of opinion are not just found in Christian circles today. They were already found in Jewish circles before the time of Jesus. Isn't it interesting how really nothing is new under the sun? Right? So the Pharisees were the people who believed in a middle ground. God foresaw all, but He didn't control everything. Humans still practice free will. In the book of Luke, the Pharisees show up a lot, 27 times. In the book of Acts, they occur mostly in one particular passage. But it's important, I think, to acknowledge certainly one aspect, and then I need to move on. One, it is apparently the case. It's apparently the case that the Apostle Paul does not regard, and the Gospel of Luke for that matter in Acts, does not regard being a Pharisee as being inconsistent with Christianity. Okay, in Acts 15 and verse 5, I'll just summarize this passage. You have people from the church at Jerusalem. Now they're trying to impose something God doesn't impose, but they're from the party of the Pharisees, and they're involved in the leadership of the church in Jerusalem. In Acts 23 and verse 6, we were talking about this last night, a small group of us up here. Paul says, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee." Acts 23 verse 6. He's talking to Jewish leaders and he says, and the Greek is emphatic, I, present tense, am a Pharisee. No, he's a Christian. Well, and a Pharisee. You see, even though Paul became a Christian, he was still a Jew, right? I mean, Christianity did not invalidate his ethnicity, right? Well, apparently, his conversion to Christianity, he did not view to violate his being a member of the Pharisees, which is something we don't think about a lot. But there are actually, we think of the Pharisees as being great villains in the New Testament. In fact, if you read the New Testament carefully, you'll find that quite a lot of the time, Pharisees are commended. Jesus, for example, in Matthew 23 says, they sit on the seat of Moses, so whatever they tell you, observe and do, but don't act the way they act, for they preach but don't practice. In other words, their attitude isn't right, and they believe some things that aren't right, but for the most part, the Pharisees, they've got it going on. All right, I want to end on this, and then I'll leave a couple of minutes for questions. This is the earliest physical description of the Apostle Paul. By the way, the picture you've been looking at is the earliest graphic depiction of the Apostle Paul. Oh, neither of these are reliable, but it's fun, so I'll read it. He was a man of middling size, so, fair size. His hair was scanty, he was bald. His legs were a little crooked and his knees were projecting, and he had large eyes. His eyebrows met, his nose was somewhat long, and he was full of grace and mercy. All right. That was Paul. Actually, this text occurs over 100 years after the death of Paul, so there's no way that this has credibility, but it seems interesting. How have you pictured Paul? Has anybody tried to picture Paul before? In your own mind? No? Never even thought about it. Well, that's fine too. He looked just like that in your mind's eye? How about that? Well, who knows? All right, anybody have any questions over any of this stuff? I skipped a lot, and if you want my notes, I'm sending them to Josh, and he'll distribute them to anyone who would like them. There's a lot more information and more specific references to ancient sources in the notes, so you can look at that. Does anybody have any questions over Paul or his education or something I said? Okay.